What if the modern conveniences you turn on without thinking? The cool air in the bedroom on a hot night, the clean, cold water that arrives the moment you turn the tap, the small sealed power cell humming inside the device in your hand were not invented in the last 150 years at all. What if every one of them was built, tested, and put into daily use by small groups of ancient craftsmen, thousands of years before the first modern engineer was born? Could it be that the comforts we now consider the markers of an advanced civilization were already operating in cities whose names most of us have never heard? Is it possible that we have been celebrating the wrong inventors in the wrong centuries for the wrong reasons? If this mystery is pulling you in, please like and subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an investigation. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We are reading every single one. These are not rhetorical questions. The evidence for each of them sits today in museum cases, in standing structures, in archaeological layers that have been carefully dated and rigorously catalogued. The pipes are still there, in the rock-cut channels of an ancient city in modern Jordan. The cool air still circulates through the abandoned chambers of houses on the Persian plateau, drawn down by towers their builders raised over 1,000 years ago. The small ceramic batteries, sealed against time, still produce a measurable electrical current when filled with the right liquid. None of this is speculation. The artifacts exist, they function. And the people who designed them, in every case, were not the figures we usually credit. They were small groups of working craftsmen and engineers, often anonymous, often unnamed in any text, working in centuries that predate the so-called rise of modern technology by a span so vast that the comparison strains belief. What you are about to hear is a tour of 3 ancient technologies that are not supposed to have existed, or if they existed, they are not supposed to have worked the way they worked, or if they worked, they are not supposed to have been as widespread, as durable, or as quietly sophisticated as the archaeological record now shows them to have been. We will follow the water. We will sit inside the cooled chambers. We will examine the battery that should not have been a battery, and by the end, we will be standing in a different relationship to the comforts of our own century, because the truth, when it is laid out, is that what we call modern is mostly a recovery of what was already known. We did not invent these technologies. We reinvented them, slowly and painfully, after the people who first invented them had been forgotten. Top. The story we were told. The standard narrative of technological progress is one most of us absorbed without thinking. It runs roughly as follows. For most of human history, people lived in conditions that were, by modern standards, primitive. Their water came from rivers and wells that they had to walk to and carry by hand. Their cooling on a hot summer day came from finding a shade tree or a cave. Their light, after sundown, came from open fires and oil lamps. Their power, in the sense of mechanical energy, came from their own muscles, from the muscles of draft animals, and in a few advanced cases from the wind and the falling water of rivers. This was, the story tells us, the human condition for thousands of years. Then, in a relatively brief span of time beginning around 250 years ago, everything changed. The steam engine arrived. The electric current was harnessed. The internal combustion engine was developed. The printing press, by then several centuries old, gave way to mass-produced books and newspapers. The telegraph compressed distance. The railroad compressed time. The light bulb pushed back the night. The refrigerator preserved food. The age of modern technology, in this telling, was a spectacular recent burst, made possible by the unique combination of scientific method, industrial production, and capital investment that emerged in 18th and 19th century Europe and North America. It was a singular event in human history, a revolution. The story is not entirely false. Real things happened in those 2.5 centuries. Real inventions changed real lives. The pace at which new technologies were developed, refined, and distributed across the population accelerated in ways that would have seemed miraculous to people of earlier generations. The standard narrative, in this respect, captures something true about the modern era, but it captures it at a cost. The cost is the implicit suggestion that what came before was, by comparison, an undifferentiated stretch of primitive existence. That our ancestors, prior to the Industrial Revolution, lived without the categories of comfort we now take for granted, that they did not have, and could not have had, anything resembling running water, climate-controlled rooms, or stored electrical power. This is where the story breaks down. Because they did. In specific places, at specific times, the people of the ancient world had all three of these things, not in our exact form, not on our exact scale, but in functional, working, daily use form. And the artifacts that prove it are sitting today in museums and on archaeological sites that anyone can visit. The story we were told about the unique modernity of our own technologies is, when held next to the actual evidence, a story that has been edited. Whole chapters have been left out. The ancient engineers who deserve the credit have been quietly removed from the textbook, replaced by a comfortable narrative of slow, primitive ascent, culminating in our own glorious moment. The first chapter that was left out is the chapter about water. The pipes of Petra, deep in the rocky desert of southern Jordan, hidden between sheer sandstone cliffs that rise hundreds of feet on either side. There is a city that should not have existed. It was carved, building by building, into the living rock of a desert canyon by a small group of nomadic Arab traders who came to be known as the Nabateans. The city is called Petra. At its height 2,000 years ago, it supported a population of approximately 30,000 people. It hosted caravans from across the ancient world, traders bringing frankincense from southern Arabia, silk from China, glass from Egypt, and silver from points further north. It was a major commercial hub for centuries, and every drop of water consumed in that city of 30,000 people, in one of the driest desert regions on the planet, was supplied by an engineered hydraulic system that worked, without modern machinery, for hundreds of years. The annual rainfall at Petra averages less than 6 inches. Most of that rain falls in violent flash floods during the brief winter rainy season. Surface streams are essentially non-existent. Groundwater, where it can be found at all, lies at depths that would have been impractical to reach with the well-digging technology of the period. By every reasonable measure, Petra should have been uninhabitable. The desert should have driven any potential settlement out within a generation or two. Instead, the Nabateans built one of the most remarkable cities of the classical world there, and they did it by mastering water. The Petra hydraulic system was not a single piece of engineering. It was an integrated network composed of dozens of different elements working in coordination. At the top of the system, on the high ground surrounding the city, were a series of rock-cut catchment basins. When the rare desert rains came, those basins captured the runoff. From the catchments, the water flowed through carefully cut channels, gradually descending toward the city below. The channels were not simple ditches. They were precisely shaped grooves, cut into the sandstone with consistent depth and consistent gradient. Some of them were lined with hydraulic plaster to reduce loss through seepage. The mad small interior steps to slow the flow during heavy rains and prevent erosion of the channel walls. The cumulative engineering of the channel network represents thousands of hours of skilled labor, organized across the entire watershed of the city. The water from the channels was stored in a network of cisterns. The cisterns were carved directly into the rock, often in the cooler shaded faces of the cliffs. Some were small and served individual buildings. Others were enormous, holding tens of thousands of gallons, and served entire districts of the city. The cisterns were sealed against evaporation with hydraulic plaster, the same material used to line the channels. Some were equipped with sediment traps at their inlets, allowing the heavier silt to settle out before it could clog the downstream pipes. Others were equipped with overflow channels that diverted excess water during particularly heavy rains, sending it to additional cisterns further downstream. But the truly remarkable element of the Petra system was the distribution network. The water was carried from the cisterns to the houses, fountains, baths, and gardens of the city through a network of ceramic pipes. The pipes were of standardized diameter. They were manufactured in interchangeable sections, each section connected to the next by a tapered male-female joint sealed with a cement compound. The diameter of the pipes was deliberately chosen. Engineering analysis of surviving sections has demonstrated that the chosen diameter was optimized to maintain laminar flow, the smooth, orderly flow that minimizes turbulent loss of energy. If the pipes had been wider, the water would have flowed inefficiently. If they had been narrower, the friction would have reduced the flow rate too much. The Nabatean engineers, working without any modern fluid dynamics theory, had arrived at the optimal pipe diameter empirically, through trial and error. Across generations of refinement, they had found the engineering sweet spot, and once they had found it, they standardized it. Every pipe in Petra, across the entire city, was made to the same diameter. Replacement parts were interchangeable. Maintenance was straightforward. The system functioned reliably for hundreds of years. What this means, in plain terms, is that a Nabatean householder in the 1st century of the Common Era, living in one of the rock-carved homes of Petra, could turn a tap or open a small valve and have clean water arrive at their kitchen. The water had been collected from rain falling on a distant ridge. It had been filtered through sediment traps. It had been stored in sealed cisterns. It had been delivered through a calibrated pipe network. It had reached the home with reliable pressure, in usable quantities, on demand. This is not metaphorical running water. This is literal running water, indistinguishable in function from what most of us have in our own homes today. And it was operating in a remote desert canyon 2,000 years ago, by a population whose entire engineering core was almost certainly fewer than 200 trained craftsmen, working in continuous coordination across generations. The system did not survive forever. After the Roman annexation of the region in 106 of the Common Era, the trade routes shifted, the city's economic foundation eroded, and the population gradually declined. By the 6th century, much of the hydraulic infrastructure had fallen out of use. Earthquakes, particularly a major one in the 8th century, damaged sections of the channels and cisterns. The pipes were not maintained. The system stopped working. But the engineering itself was sound. Modern hydrologists who have studied the surviving elements have repeatedly observed that, with relatively minor repairs, large portions of the original system could be made to function again today. The Nabateans 2,000 years ago were not merely close to modern hydraulic standards. By many measures, they were at modern hydraulic standards. The builders' WHUs left no names, a question that hovers over the Petra system, and that will hover over the other technologies in this investigation, is who exactly did the engineering, whose hands cut the channels, whose minds figured out the optimal pipe diameter, whose accumulated experience produced the operational know-how that kept the system running for centuries. The answer, in the surviving Nabatean records, is essentially silent. They left tomb dedications. They left some small fragments of administrative documentation. But they left no engineering manuals. They left no master builder signatures. They left no record of the specific individuals or workshops that designed, executed, and maintained the hydraulic system. This silence is significant, and it is consistent. Across the ancient world, the people who actually did the work of building the technologies we are about to examine almost never appear in the records by name. The pharaohs who commissioned the pyramids are remembered. The architects of the Roman aqueducts, in some cases, are remembered, but the small workshops of skilled craftsmen, the teams of specialists who knew how to mix the right hydraulic plaster, who knew how to shape a pipe to the right diameter, who knew how to set a sediment trap at the right angle, are almost entirely lost to history. They were the working professionals of their day. They were almost certainly organized into guilds or family lineages of trade. They passed their knowledge from master to apprentice generation after generation, and when the trade ended, when the political conditions changed and the demand for their skill dried up, the knowledge ended with them. There was no manual. There was no library. There was only the practice. And when the practice stopped, the knowledge was gone. This is the pattern we will see repeated throughout this investigation. The technologies were not the work of mythical inventors or famous individuals. They were the work of small groups of ordinary skilled craftsmen, working within traditions that had developed across generations, in cultures that did not, for the most part, glorify them. They are the unsung engineers of the ancient world, and the work they left behind is the only record they have. Their pipes, their cisterns, their towers, the batteries. The objust to my NTU in the absence of any other. In Petra specifically, the engineering core of the city was probably made up of perhaps a few dozen master craftsmen at any given time, supported by a larger pool of trained workers and apprentices, perhaps reaching 100 to 200 people in total active in the trade across the city. They were not, by any standard understanding, an industrial enterprise. They were a small, integrated, multi-generational professional community. And they ran the water for a city of 30,000 people for several hundred years without significant failure. The scale of what they accomplished relative to the scale of who they were is difficult to overstate. The Petra hydraulic system, as remarkable as it is would be less significant if it were the only such system in the ancient world, but it is not. The same kind of integrated water engineering appears, with regional variations across multiple ancient cultures. The Minoan Palace of Knossos on Crete, dating to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, contained an indoor water system that fed both fresh water for drinking and wastewater removal for what appear to be flush toilets. Recovered from the palace are clay pipes of standardized form, sediment traps, and channels designed for both supply and drainage. The system was operating roughly 4,000 years ago. It served a royal household and the surrounding palace community. Its level of refinement, while smaller in scale than Petra, was in some ways even more advanced because it integrated both supply and disposal in a single coordinated infrastructure. The Indus Valley civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India between approximately 2600 and 1900 years before the Common Era, possessed urban water systems on a scale that surprised the archaeologists who first uncovered them. At cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, almost every house had access to a private bathing room. The bathing rooms drained into covered street sewers that carried waste away from the residential areas. The sewers had access points for cleaning and inspection. The streets were laid out on a regular grid, with the water and sewer infrastructure planned from the beginning, rather than added later. This was not the work of a single inventor or a single dynasty. It was the work of a sustained urban engineering tradition, operating across multiple cities for at least 700 years. The Indus engineers, the Nabateans before them and after them, all left almost no written record of who they were or how they trained. The infrastructure is their entire surviving testimony. In Iran, the Qanat system represents another ancient water technology that has continued to function, in places, into modern times. A qanat is a long, sloping underground tunnel cut into a hillside, designed to collect groundwater from an aquifer and carry it by gravity to surface outlets near villages and fields. The first qanats were probably constructed in Persia approximately 3,000 years ago. They were dug by specialized workers known as the mukan, who descended into vertical shafts and excavated the connecting tunnels by hand. The qanat system spread from Persia across the Middle East, North Africa, and as far as Spain. Some qanats originally constructed more than 1,000 years ago are still in operation today, still delivering water to the communities that depend on them. The technology was so robust and so well adapted to its environment that it has outlasted multiple civilizational changes in the regions where it was deployed. Across the Mediterranean world, the Romans built on Greek and Etruscan precedents to create the famous aqueduct system that supplied water to the cities of their empire. The Roman aqueducts are the most familiar of the ancient water technologies, in part because so much of their infrastructure has survived above ground. Sections of Roman aqueducts can still be visited today in Italy, France, Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. The engineering precision of the Roman aqueducts is extraordinary. They maintain gradients of as little as a few centimeters per kilometer over distances of 50 or 100 kilometers, an accuracy that is at the very edge of what could be achieved with the surveying tools of the period. They incorporated inverted siphons to cross valleys without losing pressure. They incorporated regulator basins to control flow rates. They were maintained by specialized teams of curatores who oversaw the daily operations and addressed problems before they became failures. In Mesoamerica, the city of Palenque, built by the Maya during the 7th century of the Common Era, contained an internal pressurized water system unlike anything previously known in the New World. The Palenque builders constructed a system of stone-lined channels that funneled water from a higher elevation down through a controlled aperture, generating water pressure inside a reservoir below. The pressurized water could then have been used for fountains, for ceremonial display, or possibly for limited irrigation of garden spaces. The discovery of pressurized hydraulic engineering at Palenque, announced by archaeologists in 2010, took the field by surprise. The technology was not previously known to have been present in the pre-Columbian Americas. And yet there it was, fully functional, in a city built by Maya engineers more than 1,300 years ago. Even more striking in some ways was the engineering of the Roman bath complex. The Roman public baths, called thermae, were not simply large rooms full of water. They were sophisticated multi-stage facilities that delivered hot water, cold water, steam, and dry heat in coordinated sequence. A typical large Roman bath complex contained a frigidarium, a cold water pool, a tepidarium, a warm water transition room, a caldarium, a hot water bathing room, a laconicum, a dry heat sauna, and in many cases, a natatio, and open-air swimming pool. Each space required its own water supply. Each space required its own water supply. Each space required its own temperature regulation, and the entire facility had to manage tens of thousands of gallons of water per day, heated to specific temperatures, delivered through specific channels, and drained through specific outlets, all without modern pumps or modern thermostats. The Romans accomplished this through a system known as the hypocaust. The bathing room sat above a subfloor space, supported by short columns called pilae. Hot air from a furnace at one end of the complex circulated through the subfloor and up through hollow tiles built into the walls of the rooms above. The result was that the floors and walls of the heated rooms became radiant heat sources, warming the bathers from all sides without the need for visible flames or smoke inside the bath spaces themselves. The same principle was used to heat the bath water, by passing the water through pipes embedded in the heated floor. The system was efficient, it was scalable, and it operated in major facilities like the baths of Caracalla in Rome, on a scale that served thousands of patrons per day. The baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 of the Common Era, occupied an area of approximately 33 acres. The central bath block alone was the size of a modern stadium. The complex required a daily water supply of more than 500,000 gallons, delivered through a dedicated branch of the Aqua Marcia aqueduct. The hot water was heated by an industrial-scale furnace operation that consumed an estimated 10 tons of wood per day. The system was maintained by a permanent staff of workers, including stokers, water carriers, mosaic restorers, and the bath managers themselves, totaling perhaps a few hundred people responsible for the daily operation. By any reasonable measure, the baths of Caracalla were a working public utility on a scale that no European city would match again until the late 19th century. And again, this was not unique. Comparable bath complexes operated throughout the Roman world. The baths of Diocletian in Rome, even larger than Caracalla, served crowds of up to 3,000 bathers simultaneously. Major provincial cities like Trier, Bath in Britain, and Carthage in North Africa each maintained their own substantial bath facilities. The Roman engineering corps, distributed across the empire, kept all of these systems running. Their names are mostly lost. Their training is reconstructed only in fragments, but their work, the precision plumbing, the heated floors, the calibrated water delivery, was the daily reality of Roman urban life for several centuries. When the empire collapsed in the western provinces, most of these facilities went out of operation. Within a generation or two, the engineers who knew how to maintain a hypocaust were gone. The mosaicists who could repair a cracked bath floor had no clients. The water inspectors who oversaw the aqueducts were no longer paid. The buildings themselves, in many cases, survived for decades or centuries as ruins, as quarries for later stoneworkers, as foundations for medieval churches built on top of them. But the technology was no longer being practiced. It had become, in functional terms, dead, and it would remain dead in Europe for more than 1,000 years. What all of this implies is that the engineering of running water was not a unique or rare achievement. It was a recurring achievement in multiple unrelated cultures across a span of thousands of years. The standard narrative that modern plumbing began only in the 19th century, with the introduction of municipal water supplies in industrializing European cities, is technically true only if we define modern plumbing in the narrowest possible terms. If we define running water more broadly, as the engineered delivery of usable water on demand to the spaces where it is needed, then running water is not a modern invention at all. It is an ancient achievement, repeatedly mastered, repeatedly forgotten, when its host civilizations declined, and repeatedly rediscovered by later engineers who did not always know they were repeating someone else's work. The Nabateans of Petra, the Minoans of Knossos, the Indus engineers of Mohenjo-Daro, the Persians of the Qanat system, the Romans of the aqueducts. 6 entirely separate cultures on 3 different continents across roughly 3,000 years of human history, each independently arriving at sophisticated engineered water systems. And in every case, the systems were the work of small, specialized professional communities whose names have not, for the most part, been preserved. What it felt like to live with it. It is worth pausing on what daily life would have looked like for an ordinary resident of one of these ancient cities, because the picture, when reconstructed honestly, is closer to modern life than the textbook narrative usually allows. Take the case of an upper-middle-class Roman family living in the city of Pompeii in the 1st century of the Common Era. We know a great deal about how this family would have lived, because the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era preserved their homes in extraordinary detail beneath layers of volcanic ash. The household water system was integrated into the architecture of the home from the beginning. A small lead pipe, fed from the city's distribution network, brought fresh water into a kitchen area basin. From the basin, smaller pipes carried water to a bath area, to a fountain in the central courtyard, and in some homes to a private toilet that flushed into a connected drain. The water arrived continuously, under pressure from the elevated reservoir at the edge of the city. There was no need to fetch it from a well. There was no need to ration it for storage. The Pompeian homemaker, 2,000 years ago, simply turned a small valve and the water flowed. The cooling of that same Pompeian home was managed through architectural design. The house was built around a central open-roofed atrium that captured rainwater into a small pool. The pool, called an impluvium, served as a reservoir for cleaning purposes and as a continuous source of evaporative cooling for the surrounding rooms. Walls were thick. Windows were positioned to capture cross breezes during the cooler hours. Marble floors held the night chill well into the morning. The Pompeian summer was hot, often above 35 degrees outside, but the interior of a well-designed home remained substantially cooler. The family did not need to seek shade outdoors. The shade was already engineered into their living space. A similar pattern held in the Roman provincial city of Bath, in southern Britain, where the local population lived in homes equipped not only with piped water, but with hypocaust heating systems modified to provide gentle background warmth during the British winter. The same technology that heated the public bath complex, on a smaller scale, heated private residences for those who could afford it. A wealthy Roman-British family in the 3rd century could enjoy warm floors during cold months, hot baths on demand, and constant fresh water in their kitchen, in a town where, 1,500 years later, none of these conveniences would be available again until the late 19th century. This is the scale of what was lost when the Roman engineering tradition collapsed. Not just abstract knowledge and scrolls. Daily, embodied, lived comfort that ordinary urban families had been enjoying for centuries. When the aqueducts failed, a Roman descendant living in the same town would have found themselves, within a generation or two, hauling water by hand from a riverbank or a polluted well. They would have been heating their home, if at all, by burning wood in an open hearth that filled the room with smoke. They would have washed in cold water in a basin. On the rare occasions they washed thoroughly at all, the change, for the people experiencing it, was a real and dramatic decline in standard of living, and it persisted for more than 1,000 years. Across the eastern Mediterranean and into Persia, the decline was less complete. The Qanat system continued to function. The wind catchers continued to cool the homes of those who lived under them. Bath culture persisted in modified form, eventually evolving into the Islamic hammam tradition that preserved much of the Roman approach to public bathing, but in many specific places where the original engineering had been most advanced, the technology slipped beyond the reach of the people who had inherited the buildings. Roman bathing complexes in former colonies stood as ruins, beautiful and incomprehensible to the locals who lived around them. Aqueducts towered above villages whose residents could no longer keep them in repair. The infrastructure outlasted the institutional knowledge required to operate it, and the gap between what had been possible and what was now possible defined the experience of medieval urban life across most of Europe and parts of the wider Mediterranean world for many centuries. The fact that we in the 21st century are sitting in homes with running water and climate control is, in this longer view, not entirely an achievement of progress. It is, partially, a recovery from a long collapse. The conveniences we take for granted were available to certain populations long ago. Then they became unavailable to almost everyone for a long stretch of history. Then they slowly became available again, in the modern industrial period, and finally, in the 20th century, became widely distributed. The arc is not a straight line upward. It is a U-shape, a peak in the ancient world, a trough in the medieval period, a return to the peak, and then beyond it, in the modern era. And the people we should arguably credit, when we appreciate our current comforts, are not only the modern engineers who restore these capabilities, they are also the ancient engineers who pioneered them in the first place. There is a further consideration that does not get enough attention in popular accounts. The ancient engineering was not only a technical achievement, It was also a social achievement. To run a hydraulic system on the scale of Petra or Pompeii required not only skilled engineers but a stable institutional structure that supported their work across decades. Funding had to be available to pay for materials and labor. Apprentices had to be recruited and trained. Maintenance schedules had to be observed. Accountability had to be enforced. The technical achievements of the ancient world stood on top of organizational achievements that were just as remarkable. And in every case where the technology eventually failed, the failure was almost never a failure of the engineering itself. It was a failure of the institutions that had supported the engineering. The pipes did not fail. The cisterns did not crack on their own. The wind catchers did not stop drawing air because of any flaw in their design. They stopped working because the people who maintained them were no longer organized to do so. The collapse was social before it was material, and the recovery, when it eventually came, would also be social before it was technical. Modern plumbing in 19th century European cities did not require fundamentally new technology. It required the political and economic conditions that made municipal water utilities possible. The technology had been ready, in some form or another, for 2,000 years. It was the surrounding society that had taken that long to be ready for it. The cool air that came from a tower setting aside water for a moment. The second technology in our investigation is climate control. Specifically, the engineered cooling of interior spaces during periods of severe heat. For most of the modern era, the assumption has been that this technology, in any sustained or systematic form, dates from the 19th century. The practical refrigeration cycle was developed in the early 1800s. The first electrically powered air conditioner, designed by Willis Carrier, was patented in 1902. Mass adoption of air conditioning in residential settings did not occur until the second half of the 20th century. By that timeline, climate control is a recent achievement, a product of the modern industrial age, made possible by the harnessing of electrical power and the development of compressed gas refrigeration systems. This timeline, just as with the timeline for running water, is incomplete. Engineered climate control of interior spaces existed in the ancient world, in functional and effective form, for at least 2,000 years before Carrier filed his patent. The technology was different. It did not use electrical power. It did not use compressed gases, but it produced measurable, significant cooling of indoor spaces in some of the hottest environments on the planet, in cities where summer outdoor temperatures regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. The technology in question is the wind catcher. In Persian, it is called a badgir. Variants of the same general approach appear across the broader Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of North Africa. And the engineering principle behind it is, in retrospect, beautifully simple. A wind catcher is a tall tower, typically rising several stories above the building it serves. The tower is open at the top with vertical openings that face into the prevailing wind direction. As wind passes across the openings, it creates a pressure differential that draws air down into the tower. The air descends through the interior of the tower, cools as it descends, and is delivered into the lower rooms of the building below. In some implementations, the descending air is passed over a small cistern or fountain at the base of the tower, and the evaporative cooling from the water further reduces the air temperature before it enters the living spaces. The result, in well-designed wind catchers, is a sustained downward flow of air that arrives in the interior rooms at a temperature significantly cooler than the outside air. Modern thermal measurements of traditional wind catcher buildings in central Iran have documented interior cooling effects of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius below outdoor temperatures during peak afternoon heat. The cooling is not quite as deep as a modern air conditioner, but it is well within the range of useful comfort, and it is achieved without any electrical input whatsoever. The system runs on the wind itself. The wind catcher is not a single isolated invention. It is a regional architectural tradition with multiple distinct subtypes, and the Iranian city of Yazd, a city that has been continuously inhabited for at least 3,000 years, and that holds the distinction of being one of the oldest cities on Earth. Wind catchers have been in regular use for more than 1,000 years. Some of the surviving wind catchers in Yazd are well over 500 years old and continue to function as designed. The largest known wind catcher, on the Baghi Dolatabad estate, rises over 33 meters above the surrounding building. It still draws cool air down into the audience hall below, just as it did when it was built in the 18th century. Across the Persian Gulf region, similar towers, sometimes called barjel, have been a feature of vernacular architecture for centuries. They are not always as tall or as elaborate as the great wind catchers of Yazd, but the principle is the same. Air is captured at height, where the wind moves more freely, and channeled downward into the lived spaces below. The tradition extends from southern Iran, across the Arabian Peninsula, into parts of Egypt and the Maghreb. It is not a regional curiosity. It is the standard ancient solution to the problem of summer heat and arid environments, refined across centuries of practical use. The chanat system, mentioned earlier in connection with water, was sometimes integrated with wind catchers to produce an even more dramatic cooling effect. In some traditional Persian houses, a wind catcher would be built directly above a chanat outlet. The descending air, pulled down by the tower, would pass over the cool flowing groundwater of the chanat. Evaporative cooling would further drop the air temperature. The cooled, humidified air would then be delivered into the house through floor vents. The combined system was capable of producing summer indoor temperatures of around 20 to 25 degrees Celsius in regions where the outdoor temperature reached 45 or 50 degrees Celsius. That is a thermal differential of more than 20 degrees, achieved entirely passively, with no moving parts and no fuel input. The genius of the integrated chanat and wind catcher system lies in the way it solves multiple problems with a single architecture. The chanat itself, as a buried tunnel running for kilometers under the desert surface, draws on cool groundwater whose temperature stays consistently below outdoor air. The water in the chanat is therefore both a source of fresh drinking water and a thermal mass capable of cooling air that passes near it. The wind catcher above provides the continuous airflow needed to bring outdoor air down into contact with the cool water surface. Without the wind catcher, the chanat is just a cool underground stream, useful for drinking but not actively cooling living spaces. Without the chanat, the wind catcher delivers air that is only slightly cooler than the outside temperature. Combined, the two technologies produce something neither could produce alone. The combination represents a level of integrated engineering thinking that the modern world tends to associate with much more recent periods of history. It is also worth noting how durable this integrated system has proven to be. In a region of Iran called Yazd province, chanat and wind catcher buildings constructed 700 or 800 years ago are still in active use today as cooled summer dwellings. The original engineers who designed them have been dead for centuries. The political conditions under which they worked have changed many times. But the buildings continue to function. They continue to cool the people inside them. They continue to deliver water to the kitchens and gardens that depend on them. The engineering has outlasted nearly every other aspect of the culture that produced it. The implications of this are significant. The standard story holds that air conditioning, in any meaningful sense, is a 20th century invention. The actual record shows that air conditioning, defined as engineered indoor climate control producing significant temperature reduction below outdoor conditions, has been operating in continuous practical use in parts of the ancient and medieval world for over 1,000 years. The Persian craftsmen and engineers who designed and refined the wind catcher tradition, working in small, specialized professional communities not unlike the Nabatean hydraulic engineers, achieved indoor cooling at a level that the modern industrial world only reproduced in the 20th century. They did it without electricity. They did it without machines. They did it with stone, with brick, with careful attention to the prevailing winds, and with the cumulative wisdom of generations of craft tradition. The colon that traveled. The wind catcher is not the only ancient approach to climate control. Across the warm regions of the world, multiple cultures developed their own engineered solutions to the problem of indoor heat. In the Indian subcontinent, the architectural tradition of the jali, an intricately carved stone screen, served not only as decoration but as a precisely calibrated thermal regulator. The geometric perforations in a jali screen were designed to slow the passage of incoming air, to break up direct solar radiation into diffuse light, and to maintain a comfortable interior shadow even during the hottest parts of the day. Combined with thick stone walls and shaded courtyards, the jali tradition produced indoor environments that remained comfortably cool through the worst of the Indian summer. Tourists who visit the great Mughal-era palaces and haflas of North India often comment on the surprising coolness of the interior rooms, even on days when the outdoor temperature soars above 45 degrees. That coolness is not accidental, it is engineered. In ancient Egypt, builders used a related approach. The royal tombs and palace structures of the New Kingdom in earlier periods were oriented carefully with respect to the prevailing northerly breeze. Window openings were placed to capture incoming air during the cooler hours. Interior courtyards were shaded by overhanging upper stories, creating zones of cool refuge during the heat of the day. Some elite residences featured small reflecting pools that contributed to evaporative cooling of the surrounding air. These techniques were not formal engineering in the modern sense. They were craft conventions passed down across generations of master builders. But the cumulative effect was real. The interior of an ancient Egyptian elite residence, even during the height of summer, would have been substantially cooler than the desert outside. The Anasazi of the American Southwest, building cliff dwellings in places like Mesa Verde more than 700 years ago, oriented their structures to capture winter sunlight while shading themselves from the high summer sun. The recessed cliff alcoves in which the dwellings were built provided natural insulation, with the rock above maintaining a stable temperature year-round. Inside the alcove, the carefully placed walls and windows further moderated the temperature. The result was an environment that remained survivable in both the brutal summers and the harsh winters of the high desert. The Anasazi did not have wind catchers in the Persian style, but they had achieved, by a different route, a similar end: engineered control of indoor climate using the principles of physics, the orientation of structures, and the careful management of solar gain. Across these various cultures, a common pattern appears. The technology of climate control was not the work of a single inventor or a single civilization. It was a recurring solution arrived at by multiple unrelated cultures, each refining its own approach across generations of practical use. And in every case, the systems were maintained and operated by specialized professional communities. Master builders, stonecutters, pipe fitters, the same kind of small, skilled tradesmen networks that we saw in connection with the water systems. Anonymous in the historical record, but responsible, collectively, for keeping entire urban populations comfortable in environments that would otherwise have been intolerable. What this body of evidence suggests is that the modern industrial achievement of air conditioning, while genuinely innovative in its specific mechanism, was solving a problem that the ancient world had already addressed multiple times. The form of the solution was different, the thermodynamic precision was different, but the fundamental engineering goal, indoor temperatures comfortably below outdoor extremes, was a goal that ancient engineers, working in small specialized communities, had achieved long before any modern compressor was ever cycled. The gerinator current. The third technology in our investigation is the most surprising and the most contested. In the year 1936, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Kronig, working at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, examined a small ceramic jar that had been recovered from a site near the city. The jar was approximately 15 centimeters tall. It had a narrow neck sealed with a plug of bitumen, an asphalt-like natural compound used as a sealant in the ancient Middle East. Inside the jar, Koenig found a small copper cylinder with an iron rod suspended down its center. The components had been carefully assembled. The copper cylinder fit into the jar in a specific orientation. The iron rod ran down the center axis of the cylinder. The whole assembly was sealed, presumably to retain some kind of liquid that had once filled the cylinder. Koenig looked at the assembly and recognized something that should not have been possible. The configuration of components was identical in its essentials to a galvanic cell: a copper electrode, an iron electrode, a non-conductive separator between them, a sealed enclosure capable of holding an electrolyte. The ancient jar in Koenig's analysis was a battery, or had been a battery, or could have been used as a battery. The dating of the jar placed it in the Parthian period, roughly 2,000 years ago. Koenig published his findings in 1940. The artifact, since known as the Baghdad Battery, became one of the most discussed and debated objects in the archaeological literature. The simplest test of Koenig's interpretation was straightforward. Could the assembly, as configured, actually produce a measurable electrical current? The answer, demonstrated repeatedly in laboratory replications since the 1940s, is yes. When the cylinder is filled with an acidic liquid such as vinegar, lemon juice, or grape juice, the copper-iron electrochemical reaction produces a measurable voltage of around half a volt to 1 volt, depending on the specific electrolyte used. The current is small, but it is real. The artifact functions as a battery. There is no question about whether the assembly can produce electricity. The question is whether the ancient builders intended it to do so, or whether the electrical effect is an accidental property of an object designed for some other purpose. The mainstream archaeological response has been cautious. Most professional Assyriologists and historians of the Parthian period have tended to argue that the jars, of which several similar examples have been found, were probably storage vessels for sacred scrolls, the copper cylinder would have served as an inner container. The iron rod might have been a stiffener. The bitumen seal would have protected the contents from moisture. The electrical effect in this reading is an unintended consequence of the materials chosen for non-electrical reasons. The objects look like batteries because of the convergence of design constraints, not because batteries were what their makers had in mind. This is a defensible interpretation. It is consistent with the absence of any other electrical apparatus from the same archaeological context. There are no wires connecting multiple batteries in series, which would be expected if the technology was being used to generate higher voltages. There are no electroplated objects that could only have been produced with electrical current. There are no preserved descriptions in any surviving Parthian text that describe the batteries or how they were used. The mainstream interpretation has these gaps in the evidence on its side. The case for the artifacts as deliberate batteries is, in this view, an argument from the appearance of the objects rather than from any positive evidence of their use. But the case is not quite as clean as the mainstream framing suggests. Several elements of the artifacts continue to challenge the storage vessel interpretation. The copper cylinder is constructed with a quality of workmanship that exceeds what would be necessary for a mere inner container. The cylinder is rolled from a single sheet of copper and seamed shut along its long axis. The iron rod is suspended in the center of the cylinder by a small organic stopper, possibly originally a piece of wood or cork that has not survived. The bitumen seal at the top of the jar shows clear evidence of having been applied to protect a liquid contents. And the configuration of components is, mechanically, identical to a galvanic cell. If the makers were not aware of the electrical potential of the assembly, then the resemblance is one of the more striking coincidences in the archaeological record. There is one further consideration. Several pieces of ancient gold jewelry from the same general region and period show what some metallurgists have argued are signs of being electroplated rather than gilded by mercury amalgam or hammered foil techniques. The interpretation is contested. Mercury gilding can produce results that are difficult to distinguish from electroplating without precise chemical analysis. But the question has been raised, by metallurgists looking at specific pieces, of whether the surface microstructure is more consistent with electroplating than with the alternative explanations. If even a few of those pieces are genuinely electroplated, then someone in the ancient Middle East was producing enough electrical current in an organized enough way to perform actual practical electrochemistry, which would, in turn, support the interpretation of the Baghdad battery and its analogs as deliberate electrical devices, SIPTA. The question of what they knew. The most honest answer about the Baghdad battery is that we do not yet know, with full confidence, what the makers intended. The mainstream interpretation that the jars were storage vessels remains a reasonable position. The alternative interpretation that they were small-scale batteries used for some kind of low-current electrical work, possibly the gilding of small metal objects, or possibly some ceremonial application involving mild electrical sensation, also remains a reasonable position. The evidence, as it currently stands, does not unambiguously favor either reading. Future discoveries in the form of better preserved associated artifacts or written descriptions of the technology may eventually settle the question. Until then, the artifacts sit in their museum cases, performing the same electrical function they performed 2,000 years ago, while their original purpose remains an open question. What is not in question is the underlying fact that the components for small-scale electrochemistry were available in the ancient world. Copper was widely available. Iron was widely available. Acidic liquids were everywhere, in the form of vinegar and citrus juices and fermented beverages. The basic chemistry of the galvanic cell does not require any rare or exotic materials. It requires only the convergence of two different metals and an acidic electrolyte. Anyone working extensively with metals and liquids would, sooner or later, have encountered the phenomenon. Whether the ancient artisans recognized what they were observing is the question. But the phenomenon itself was available to be observed. And the Baghdad battery, whatever its intended purpose, demonstrates that the components could be assembled in a form that produces a working current. There are other artifacts and historical references that suggest some level of awareness of electrical phenomena in the ancient world. The Greek philosopher Thales of Miletus, in the 6th century before the Common Era, is recorded as having described the phenomenon of static electricity produced by rubbing amber. The Greek word for amber, electron, is the root of our modern word electricity. Static electricity is not the same as the chemical electricity of a battery, but the historical record does indicate that the ancients were aware of electrical phenomena as a distinct category of natural occurrence. They had a word for it. They had a bird for it. Whether they ever moved from the awareness of static electricity to the deliberate production of chemical electricity is a question the archaeological record does not yet definitively answer. But the gap between those two forms of electrical knowledge is not as large as it might appear. A culture that observes amber producing sparks and a culture that observes copper-iron galvanic reactions producing current are working with the same general phenomenon, the flow of charge between materials of different electrical potential. It is possible that some ancient artisans, somewhere in the long span of pre-modern history, made the connection between the two. It is possible that the Baghdad battery is one of the surviving traces of that connection. We do not yet have enough evidence to say so with full confidence, but we have enough evidence to say that the question is genuine, and that the assumption of complete ancient ignorance of practical electrical phenomena is, at minimum, premature. The pattern stepping back from the three specific technologies, a pattern emerges that is worth stating plainly. The pattern is this. In each of the three areas, ancient craftsmen working in small specialized professional communities achieved engineering solutions that, by the standard timeline of technological history, should not have been possible until the modern industrial era. They achieved running water at a residential scale. They achieved climate control of indoor spaces at functional thermal differentials. They almost certainly achieved at least some forms of practical electrochemistry, even if the full extent of that achievement remains a matter of ongoing debate. The technologies were not centralized. They were not the product of vast laboratories or massive state-directed research programs. They were the product of small workshops, family lineages of trade, regional craft traditions, working within specific cultural and environmental contexts to solve specific practical problems. And the pattern continues beyond these three. Consider the matter of optical lenses. In 1985, the British researcher David Brewster published an analysis of a small piece of polished rock crystal that had been recovered from the ancient Assyrian palace at Nimrud. The artifact, now known as the Nimrud lens, dates to approximately 750 before the Common Era. It is a small oval lens, roughly 4 centimeters across, ground from a single piece of natural rock crystal. Under modern optical analysis, the lens has been demonstrated to function as a magnifying glass, with a focal length of approximately 12 centimeters. The optical surfaces are not perfectly figured by modern standards, but they are figured. They are not the result of accidental polishing. They are the result of deliberate grinding by craftsmen who understood, at least empirically, that a curved, transparent surface could focus light. Whether the Nimrud lens was used as a magnifier, as a starter for fire making, or as a decorative inlay, the underlying optical capability is real. The Assyrians, 2,700 years ago, could grind a working lens. Several other ancient lenses have been recovered from sites in Egypt, Greece, and Italy, dating to various points across the first millennium before the Common Era. Some of them, mounted in copper or bronze frames, appear to have been used as personal magnifiers, possibly by craftsmen working with fine details on small objects, possibly by scribes attempting to read very small texts. The exact applications remain debated, but the lenses themselves are real artifacts. They sit in museum cases. They function as lenses. Whoever made them, whoever used them, knew enough about the behavior of light through curved transparent media to produce a working tool. Consider also the matter of metallurgy, the technique for producing what the modern world has come to call Damascus steel. The patterned blade steel that holds an exceptionally sharp edge and exhibits distinctive flowing surface markings was practiced by craftsmen in the Middle East from roughly the 3rd century to the 18th century of the Common Era. The technique was lost in the late 18th century, when the source of the specific iron ore used in the original process became unavailable. For more than 200 years afterward, no modern metallurgist could fully reproduce the original Damascus steel. Modern attempts produced approximations. They did not produce duplicates. Only in the last several decades, with the application of electron microscopy to surviving Damascus blades, has the structure of the original steel been understood. The blades contain carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires, structures that modern science has only recently learned to produce in the laboratory. Whatever the medieval Damascus smiths were doing, when they forged their blades by hand in their workshops, they were producing nanostructured steel by means that have still not been fully reconstructed. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, briefly mentioned in our investigation of ancient builders. The mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck in the early 20th century, is a small bronze device approximately the size of a shoebox. It contains at least 30 interlocking gears of extraordinary precision when operated by a hand crank. The device modeled the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, predicted eclipses, and tracked the cycles of the Olympic Games. It was constructed in the 2nd century before the Common Era, in a Greek workshop whose location and identity have not been definitively established. The mechanism appears in the archaeological record with no clear precedent and no clear successor. The technology of intricate astronomical gearing did not reappear in European civilization for another 1400 years, when medieval clockmakers began constructing mechanical timepieces in Christian monasteries. And even those medieval clocks were not as precise in their astronomical calculations as the Antikythera mechanism had been more than a millennium earlier. Each of these is an example of a technology that emerged from a specific ancient craft community, was practiced for some period of time, and was then lost when the community that produced it was disrupted or destroyed. What this means, in plain terms, is that the ancient world was full of working technologies that we are still in the process of rediscovering. Not all of them, not in every form, but more of them, in more domains, and at higher levels of refinement than the standard narrative of technological progress allows for. Modernity is not a sudden emergence from primitive conditions. It is, in significant part, a recovery and an extension of capabilities that earlier generations had already developed and then lost. Every time a modern engineer is impressed by what a Roman aqueduct could do, or by what a Persian wind catcher could achieve, or by what a Nabatean hydraulic system could deliver, the impression is not just a quaint admiration of ancestral effort. It is, more honestly, an acknowledgement that someone got there first, with less, and in many cases more durably. Tight the technologies were lost. The question that naturally arises is how, exactly, technologies of this sophistication could be lost in the first place. If the ancient world had running water and air conditioning and at least some forms of practical electrical work, why did those capabilities not simply propagate forward through the centuries until the modern era? Why did medieval Europe, centuries after the fall of the Roman aqueducts, not have residential running water? Why did the wind catcher tradition of Persia not become the standard solution for indoor cooling across the Eurasian world? Why does the modern world not credit the Nabatean engineers, the Indus engineers, the Persian craftsmen, and the many other ancient professional communities as the rightful predecessors of our own 21st century plumbers, HVAC technicians, and electricians? The answer, drawn from the broader history of technology, is that craft knowledge is fragile in a specific way. It depends on the continuous operation of the tradition that produces and transmits it. If the tradition is broken, by war, by economic collapse, by environmental catastrophe, by cultural transformation, the knowledge can be lost within a single generation. Master craftsmen die. Apprentices are not trained. The techniques are not written down because, in many cases, they were never the kind of knowledge that lent itself to writing. They were embodied skills, transmitted through hands-on training, through the daily practice of the trade, through the inherited intuition of professionals who had spent their lives in the work. When the work stopped, the knowledge stopped with it. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is the textbook example of this kind of catastrophic loss. The Romans had inherited and refined a tradition of urban engineering that, at its peak, supplied running water to dozens of cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Within a few centuries of the fall, most of that infrastructure had collapsed. The aqueducts were no longer maintained. The pipe networks were no longer repaired. The professional communities that had operated the systems had dispersed. Cities that had once had running water on demand returned to drawing water from rivers and wells. The knowledge of how to build and maintain a Roman aqueduct, in any practical applied sense, was largely lost in Europe by the end of the 7th century. It was not significantly recovered until the Renaissance in the early modern period, more than 1,000 years later. And even then, the recovery was partial. Many of the specific techniques the Roman engineers had used were not fully reconstructed until modern hydrology turned its attention back to the surviving infrastructure in the 19th and 20th centuries. The same pattern applies to the other technologies. The Nabatean hydraulic system, after the decline of Petra, was simply not used. The pipes were not maintained. The plaster degraded. The cisterns silted up. The next inhabitants of the region had no need for a system designed to support a city of 30,000. The knowledge of how to build it, locked in the trained hands of the craftsmen who had operated it, dispersed when the craft community dispersed. Within a few generations, the system was a ruin. The technology had not been forgotten in the abstract. It had simply ceased to be practiced, and once the practice ended, the practical knowledge ended with it. the wind catcher tradition has had a different trajectory, in part because it has remained in continuous use in a number of regions. In Yazd, the wind catchers are still operating. The craft of building them is still taught. The technology has survived, even as the world has industrialized around it. But in regions where the wind catcher tradition was disrupted, by colonialism, by economic transformation, by the introduction of cheap mass-market air conditioning, the knowledge of the underlying engineering has tended to fade. They are photographed and visited as cultural heritage, but the working understanding of how to design a new one for a new building, in a new context with the right thermal performance, is not as widely held as it once was. Even a still functioning ancient technology can quietly become a museum piece when the tradition that produced it is no longer being actively practiced. The Baghdad battery, if it was indeed a battery, represents a more extreme case. Whatever the underlying technique was, it is essentially gone. There is no living tradition that descends from the Parthian electrochemists, if that is what they were. The artifact survives. The principle survives in the modern science of electrochemistry, but the bridge between the two, the practical art of the people who actually made the jars and used them, is broken. Bow just as they did 2,000 years ago, but what they were for, in the lived practice of the people who made them, can only be reconstructed from inference. Philosophical reflection. There is something worth pausing on in the picture that has emerged. It is the realization that the comforts and conveniences of our own era are not, in most cases, unprecedented. They are, more often than we acknowledge, recoveries. The modern resident of a comfortable air-conditioned home, with running water in the kitchen and a charged battery in the device on their nightstand, is enjoying the fruits of 3 different technological achievements that were already known in working form in the ancient world. The specific implementations are modern. The underlying capabilities are not. We did not begin from nothing. We restarted from the rubble of what was already known. This reframing has practical and philosophical implications. The practical implication is that our own technologies are perhaps less fragile than we tend to assume, but also less unique. Less fragile because the underlying principles, in many cases, have been demonstrated in multiple unrelated contexts across history. The fundamentals of fluid dynamics that govern the petropipes also govern modern municipal plumbing. The fundamentals of evaporative cooling that drove the Persian wind catchers also drive modern absorption refrigeration. The fundamentals of electrochemistry that may have driven the Baghdad battery also drive every lithium-ion cell in every modern device. The principles are stable. They have been rediscovered before. They could be rediscovered again if some catastrophe were to disrupt our own technological continuity. But the technologies are also less unique than the standard narrative suggests. The narrative of modern progress tends to celebrate our own civilization as the singular instance of true technological advancement, with all earlier societies arrayed along a long primitive prelude leading up to us. The actual record is more democratic. Multiple ancient civilizations achieved working solutions to the same problems we have since solved. Their solutions used different mechanisms, but they produced functionally equivalent results in many cases. Our distinctiveness is not in having invented running water or climate control or stored electrical power. Our distinctiveness, if it exists at all, lies in scale, in distribution, in the speed at which we can deploy these capabilities to large populations across vast distances. The fundamental capabilities themselves are old. We are not the first. The philosophical implication is harder to articulate, but it touches on something that may be worth sitting with. If the conveniences we celebrate as the markers of our advanced civilization were already, in some form, available to small, specialized communities thousands of years ago, then the relationship between technological capability and civilizational greatness is more complicated than it appears. The Nabateans had running water, and their civilization eventually fell. The Persians have had wind-cooled houses for over 1,000 years, and their civilization has gone through multiple transformations during that time. The Parthians, if they had electrical capability of any kind, did not parlay it into anything that survived their political dissolution. Technologies by themselves do not save the cultures that produce them. They can outlast their makers, sit in the ground for 2,000 years, and emerge as artifacts in museum cases, while the people who made them have been dust for 100 generations. This is a humbling thought. Our own civilization, with all its capabilities, may not be exempt from the same arc. The technologies we are proud of will eventually become the artifacts of a future archaeologist. The networks we depend on will eventually fall into disrepair. The professional communities that maintain our running water and our climate control and our electrical infrastructure will, like all such communities before them, be vulnerable to the disruptions that come for every civilization in time. We are not at the end of history. We are at one moment in a long and recurring pattern. The pattern is not new. It has played out with variations many times before, and the artifacts of the previous rounds are still here, lying in the desert, sealed in museum cases, waiting for whoever comes next to look at them and realize that someone got there first. Closing reflection. If you are watching this video right now, you are almost certainly within a few feet of all three of the technologies we have just discussed. There is running water, somewhere in your home. Accessible at the turn of a tap, there is some form of climate control, an air conditioner or a heater or both, regulating the temperature of the space you are in. There is at least one battery, and probably many batteries, sitting inside the devices that surround you. We live with these things so closely that we have stopped noticing them. They have become part of the texture of our existence. They are background. We do not think of them as remarkable, because they are everywhere, and because they always work, and because we have always had them in our own lifetimes. But they have not always existed. And what is more significant, they were not always invented in the centuries we credit them to. Each one of them has a longer and more interrupted history than the standard narrative tells. Each one of them has roots in ancient craft traditions, whose practitioners have been forgotten. Each one of them is a small, quiet inheritance from people we have never been taught to remember. The Nabatean engineer who shaped the pipes of Petra, the Persian craftsman who fitted the bricks of the wind catcher in Yazd, the Parthian artisan, whoever they were, who sealed the small ceramic battery of Baghdad with bitumen and copper and iron. These are the people whose work, in altered form, is still functioning in your home tonight. There is an honor we have not given them. There is a credit we have withheld, mostly without thinking, because the standard narrative did not foreground their contribution. They lived in cultures that did not record their names. They worked in trades that did not produce many surviving documents. They were, in their own time, the equivalent of the modern plumbers and HVAC technicians and electricians who keep our cities functioning today. They were ordinary, skilled professionals. They did extraordinary work. And for the most part, they have been written out of the story. Perhaps the next time you turn on your tap, or feel the cool air arriving from the vent above your bed, or pick up a device powered by a small sealed cell that holds the charge until you call on it, you will think of them. The 200 or so anonymous Nabateans who kept the water running in Petra for centuries. The anonymous Persian builders who refined the wind catcher across 1,000 years of practice. The unknown maker of the Baghdad jar, whose small assembly of copper and iron and bitumen still produces a measurable current when offered the right liquid. They are not celebrities. They will never be famous. But they are the original engineers of the comforts you are surrounded by, and the line that connects their work to ours is older and stranger, and more humbling than we have been led to think. Their hands shaped what your hands now reach for, every day, without thinking. Perhaps the deepest realization is not that they had what we have. The deepest realization is that they had it first. They had it without us. They had it without the Industrial Revolution, without electricity, without the assumption that human civilization moves only forward. They had it because they were patient, because they were skilled, because they were organized into small communities of competent professionals who passed their knowledge from one generation to the next. They are the proof that the comforts we enjoy are not unique to our era. They are the proof that the ancient world, in many quiet, specific ways, was already further along than we have been told. And it is worth one final thought, in closing, about what this means for the way we treat our own technologies. We tend to assume that what we have built is permanent, that the systems we depend on every day will continue to work indefinitely, regardless of what happens to the institutions that maintain them. The history of ancient technology suggests otherwise. The Roman bath complexes did not fail because of any defect in their construction. They failed because the empire that maintained them collapsed. The Petra hydraulic system did not stop working because the pipes were fundamentally flawed. It stopped working because the city it served had emptied out. The wind catchers of forgotten regions did not become useless because of any change in physics. They became useless because the families that lived under them stopped maintaining the inherited knowledge of how to design new ones. In every case, the technology was sound, What failed was the social fabric around it. And our own technologies, magnificent as they are no more immune to that pattern than the ancient ones were. If something happened in our own century to disrupt the institutional structures that maintain our running water and our climate control and our electrical grids, we too would discover, perhaps within a single generation, that we had become the inheritors of infrastructure we no longer fully understood. Perhaps the question that lingers after all of this is not how they did it. Perhaps it is what we will leave behind that someone, 2,000 years from now, will dig up and study and feel about us the way we are feeling just now, about them. Whether what we leave will be better, whether it will be more durable, whether it will tell the story we hope it will tell, or whether some future archaeologist, brushing dust away from a small fragment of our world, will simply have to admit, as we have admitted tonight, that the people of an earlier age figured something out, that the people of an earlier age have yet to recover.